Welcome to the D-Spot podcast. Dr. Dana McNeil is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in working with couples using the Gottman method. Her evidence-based practice provides support for the wide range of relationship issues that modern couples face. By using her open, affirming, and outside-of-the-box thinking, Dr. Dana is able to approach her work with couples by bringing both insights and tools that reflect the realities of today's complicated relationships. Dr. Dana features guests on her podcast that include a unique array of celebrities, CEOs, influencers, and everyday folks who are all working on navigating new conversations about how society views what goes into a successful relationship. And now, here's your host, Dr. Dana McNeil.
Hello, it's Dr. Dana McNeil. You are on the D-Spot podcast. You are in for a treat today. I have a new friend in the podcast house. Her name is Lena Derhally. Lena is a licensed psychotherapist. She is Imago certified, which we might talk about that in a little bit. She has been a clinical instructor at the Department of Psychology and Behavioral Health at George Washington School of Medicine. So she knows what she's talking about. And Lena has also written 2 books. I can't believe, and they're so interesting. So the first book that she wrote is called My Daddy is a Hero, How Chris Watts Went from Family Man to Family Killer. Dun, dun, dun. That sounds very exciting. And number 2, The Facebook Narcissist, How to Identify and Protect Yourself and Your Loved Ones from Social Media Narcissism. Hi, Lena. Welcome to
Hi,
the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
This is so cool. You have such an interesting life. I mean, going from instructing psychology to writing books about true crime and social media. What inspires you to choose projects? How do you go about it?
Yeah, I think it probably roots back to my own experience, having been in an abusive relationship myself, which I should say was, an emotionally and mentally abusive relationship. So not physical abuse, although I believe had I had stayed, and luckily the circumstances were that it was a long distance relationship, which made it a lot easier to end.
Yeah.
But, as soon as I got out of that relationship, as we say, hindsight is 2020, I read a book called Help, I'm in Love with a Narcissist. And
okay.
It's a really old school book, but, I was in my early mid-20s. And so, it was like a light bulb had come off, and if somebody had finally put the language to what I had experienced and normalized it for me. And that was so therapeutic. At the time I was doing my second master's in counseling as well. So I was going through that program. And I think it really inspired me to help other people recognize the signs of abuse. And so the true crime and the books that I write are basically just manifestations and extensions from that passion of, helping people avoid abusive situations, whether it's from social media or relationally, or even a family member or a friend.
Because not everybody is as strong as you are. Not everybody does get out. Not everybody does find a resource that they identify with that helps them navigate it and learn coping skills. I mean, I can see why you were inspired to kind of pick up this journey for others. I think that's what a kind thing to do for the world, where you could have just been selfish and been like, I'm good, see you later. And now you're like, hey, let me share and normalize this experience, and let's start bringing it into conversation so that there's no mistaking what's happening here.
Yeah. And I think I just really believe that kindness and empathy, I mean, it sounds cheesy and cliched, but really it is the balm to heal the world, and that there's so many, as as a therapist, we deal with people who have so much childhood trauma and have been treated so poorly as children and don't even have the language to assert their own needs or feelings. And sometimes that can play a part in why it's so hard to leave abusive relationships. So I just have an enormous amount of empathy and sensitivity to that. So that's, again, one of my passions is helping people, again, even if we can't, and also letting them realize we can't change other people a lot of the time.
Yeah. Even though we think if we're enough that they'll want to change versus that's who they are and I got to do me.
Yes, exactly. And I had fallen into that as well. I was thinking, oh, if only I loved this person enough, because this person also had childhood trauma. And so if I had loved this person enough, I put myself in the Mother Teresa martyr role, that if I gave him unconditional love, then he would be healed. And that was a learning experience that I had to go through myself too, that love is never enough in abusive situations.
So I want to make sure that we talk today about what you define as a narcissist, because it is such the buzzword these days and it's been around a long time. It's not like it's a new concept. And so I would love it if we could kind of walk through what your definition is. And then after that, I really want to chat about, how do I know that I'm in a relationship with one, and what can I help identify as the reasons that I might be more drawn to one? Right? Because I think that's where you can do a lot of valuable use with this platform. So what is a narcissist clinically?
Yes, great question. Great question. And yes, I usually start with what it is not, right? Because
okay, cool.
on the cover of my my book, The Facebook Narcissist, I have a picture of a woman with duck lips taking a selfie of herself, because that's what people think of when they think of narcissism. They think of vanity, which is a very, very small part of it. I actually think that's not really the main feature of it at all. Like, it can be very attention seeking, but there's different flavors of narcissism, which we can get into later as well. So not all narcissism is grandiose. So I think what people think about when they think of narcissism is grandiosity and attention seeking and vanity, which again can be part of the profile. But clinically, it's really characterized by, I think, first and foremost, a lack of empathy, and a very severe lack of empathy. And this is the personality disorder. So, how we're trained, we have this DSM, I call it the psychology Bible.
Yep.
And that's a personality disorder that is thought to be more rare. And, I like to quote Dr. Craig Malkin. He wrote a great book called Rethinking Narcissism. And he defines narcissism as on a spectrum. And so people at the high, let's say it's like 0 through 10, people at the highest end of the spectrum of narcissism, let's say 8 through 10, they may be qualifying as having the personality disorder, which again is extreme lack of empathy, exploitation of others, and entitlement. So you really want to look at those three major factors. And that are also, I think, three major factors in what happens with abusive people is they exploit others, they have low empathy, they're very entitled, and everything is very self-serving to meet their own needs. So they don't care about the needs of other people, and they just act as such. And so there's other features, again, that will, that you can check off to say, okay. And I don't recommend people diagnosing people at home with the personality disorder, but, just thinking about those main things, which Craig Malkin calls the triple E, lack of empathy, exploitation, and entitlement, and that those are patterns of behavior. So I also like to say, we all have moments of low empathy. You know what I mean? Like, I snap at my kids sometimes, and, and so it's not that we have these little moments where we are not being our best selves. It's patterns of behavior that occur over time. So I think that's important too. It doesn't go away.
I hear a lot of conversation these days, and maybe because I'm a therapist and hanging out in these conversations, but that there's this idea for those of us that are lay people listening to this, there's a personality disorder, and then there's something that you have kind of developed over time, right? Nature versus nurture. And so is it your perspective that this is just congruent to how this person has always been? You're not being specially picked on by the way that they perceive you because they've perceived themselves this way? Or is it that they've been bullied, and so this is like a coping skill? Because I hear lots of sort of buzz around these different topics, and it would be nice to have the expert tell us what's happening, or is it both?
Yeah, and I think it's complicated, right? And there's different theories with the nature versus nurture, and a lot of the times there's just theories. We do have some studies of the brain of a narcissist, which again, similar to a brain of a psychopath or a sociopath, they may have reduced capacity in the brain where your empathy is, and things like that. So there's a lot of different studies and genetic studies too, in twins and narcissism that shows that it can be heritable. So I do think it is often a perfect storm of maybe how you're born, but the environment can, bring that out and exacerbate it and things of that nature. And then again, it's depending on the severity of the narcissism. So I think with narcissistic personality disorder, which is the cluster B personality disorder, and those cluster Bs often all kind of have lack of empathy, there is a lot of overlap with psychopathy and sociopathy, which are not diagnoses, like clinical diagnoses, but they're characterized by extreme lack of empathy. And with there's something called the dark triad, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism, that word is always so hard to pronounce. Right. That's very manipulative behavior of people who like power and control over others. So you can have those three things coexist with each other. And often I think when it's that extreme, that is definitely probably something with the brain and how they were born. But I think maybe on the lower levels, or, of the border of narcissistic personality disorder, and maybe somebody who has a lot of these traits of narcissism, there may be a lot of developmental trauma, and that's how that personality disorder develops. So I think that's a very common theory, is that the child had a childhood where they were neglected, unseen, and so the narcissism was a way to protect themselves from feeling so inferior and unseen and unloved.
Yeah, it became, in a way, a maladaptive coping skill, right?
Yeah.
For those on the spectrum where it's not like a true brain injury where we're like, you need some help, like legitimately, you would probably need to get you some mood stabilizer and there's some medication involved, versus, hey, I did the best I could in a lot of the ways that like a substance misuse could be a maladaptive coping behavior, right? And so
exactly,
knowing where your partner is on the spectrum isn't necessarily super helpful, because you're still on the receiving end of something that doesn't feel good. Yes. So what kind of person or personality might be the most attractive to or attracted to somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder?
Yeah, and I might cite Craig Malkin again because I love his work, but
Great.
he'll say,
we'll
the opposite.
In the show
yeah,
notes.
Rethinking Narcissism is his big book. But at the other end of the spectrum of narcissism is what Craig would call egoism, which is, I like to use the term people pleasers. And again, that it's extreme people pleasers. So there's almost no real identity or sense of self, and everything is around doing things for other people to make other people like them. And again, that's usually a major result of childhood trauma.
Right.
And also, we might say empaths. So some people like to characterize themselves as empaths, people who, again, I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I sort of had this Mother Teresa martyrdom thing going on, where I was like, oh, I love this person enough, or give to them enough, then that will make them nicer. That will make them, if they feel that love, that can change who they are. So I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of empathy and rationalize a lot of bad behavior, right? So
validate it, makes sense.
Yeah.
Of course, look at what's happened to them.
Mm-hmm,
somebody's finally going to give them love. It's just that they don't know what true love is like. Let me just show them.
Yes, but I'd also like to say that anybody, can be charmed by a narcissist, because these type of personalities, they do something which kind of goes into your question that you want to have come later, is this love bombing aspect, which means that they know how to put on a very charming show. They're very, very into you at first. You feel really special around them. And that's part of the manipulation. And so like they kind of use that as a way to draw you in. And so anybody, I said that's normal. To want to feel special and to have somebody who brings you flowers, and it's sort of like these rom-coms that we're inundated with. I actually read an interesting study a few years ago that said watching rom-coms makes stalker behavior more acceptable to people, which I thought was really interesting. So it's like the idea of somebody standing outside your window and, like how that's portrayed as romantic,
Right.
but in
Yeah.
the real world.
I was just talking with a client the other day about, remember that movie? Well, you're younger than me, but in the movie from the 80s, Say Anything, where
Oh,
the guy
yeah.
was holding the boombox outside of her
Yeah.
bedroom window and would just not go away. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh my God, he loves me so much.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I instilled somebody wanting to stalk me. That's so cool.
Yes, exactly. And of course, again, not every person who does grand romantic gestures is a narcissist. So I have to say that too. But generally, we say that's sort of a red flag, and anybody can be drawn into that. And the other thing is, like I said, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
When you're in something like that, it's especially for the first time, it is very confusing to be in this relationship with a Jekyll and Hyde personality, which is they were so kind and so loving and your biggest fan. And then all of a sudden you start to see glimpses of this kind of darker character. And that's what happens as you go further into a relationship with a narcissist. And then the darker character shows himself or herself more and more as time goes on. And that can be really confusing because the other thing, the narcissist I was in a relationship, he used to do with me is verbally berate me and walk away or leave or tell me, oh, I'm never going to talk to you again. And then an hour later, he would call me and pretend nothing ever happened. So
gaslighting, our other new favorite phrase.
Yes, which is again another thing we'll talk about, which is a main tactic of abuse. But it really does make you think, am I crazy? Wait, an hour ago he was screaming at me and telling me how horrible I was, and now he's like this back to his jovial kind of fun self, because they do have this other side that's, again, it's incredibly charming. They can be really funny, really fun to be around. And so then you're like, okay, that was just a bad moment. I'm going to excuse that. And then everything's fine again until it's not. On the extreme end of abuse, there can be violence and sexual abuse, and again, extreme verbal abuse. And then they will apologize with grand gestures like presents and flowers. And again, this is all just very confusing. And there's also something called trauma bonding, but I'll stop here for now.
Well, I mean, it's very clear why somebody who views themselves as a recovering people pleaser, right, would be attracted to this personality, because you're less likely to set a healthy boundary. You're less likely to be like, yeah, I totally know you had an off day, but what are we going to do when that happens again? Or, hey, this didn't feel okay. I need to, have you acknowledge that for me. You're less likely to do that. And so you're just enabling that behavior unintentionally, because it doesn't feel okay to bring it up, because God forbid they go away and you don't have anybody to love.
Yeah. And there's also the fear, because a big sign too of being in a relationship with an abusive person or narcissist is constantly feeling like you're walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
And so not wanting to poke the bear, not knowing when or where they're going to react and how they're going to react to you. So you're also kind of living in a state of anxiety in a lot of ways when you're walking on eggshells, because again, you just don't know what you're going to get and when you're going to get it. And so I think that's also the part of sort of just kind of going inward and being more meek and not challenging or confronting people when they treat you poorly, is because there's some fear involved.
And I would probably say that you'll agree with me that narcissists are the least likely to go to therapy.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So I don't get a big crack at them very often. Unless the partner demands that they come in. It's usually like they've finally started to get some boundaries. It's the end. This person is doing it as self-preservation versus I want to make amends with you. And then they're throughout the course of the session somehow trying to get the therapist to agree with them and still kind of leaving their partner on the side.
Yes. And, I've spoken to a lot of, especially females who have survived narcissistic abuse, especially after my first book, which was essentially about the links with narcissism and domestic violence. And in this case, ultimately killing the family to leave the family for another woman, which is what we call the discard phase. And so I received letters from women all over the world, really thanking me for writing that book, because they also say when they've gone to couples therapy, for example, with their partner who's abusive, what can be really hard sometimes is the abusive partner knows how to charm the therapist, and so sometimes that can be really traumatic for the person involved because the therapist can't see what they're experiencing. And so I also think what I'm really excited about is places like Psychotherapy Networker and some prominent psychologists who really work with narcissism are doing a lot of training now on it, and gaslighting and abuse and things like that. So
Terry Real is great. With if anyone's listening and they want to see a amazing male therapist deal with a narcissist, he's got great work. A true narcissist. So, okay. So I'm identifying, someone's listening to this and they're identifying with like, oh yeah, check. That sounds like me. What's the next steps? What should they be doing?
Yeah. So generally, if it's really bad, if you're seeing all of these things, like we said, there's gaslighting. I gave that example where, I experienced this type of verbal abuse. And then, gaslighting would also look like if I had called him out on it and said, you said this to me. He would say something back like, oh, you're too sensitive. You didn't take a joke. Like, I didn't mean that. Or no, I didn't say that. It can be complete denial.
You heard it wrong. Or I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yes. And the criticism, like real criticism, there could be the stonewalling, the silent treatment. Blame shifting is kind of another form of gaslighting where you express a concern. And instead of the partner taking accountability for that, they turn it around on you. Well, if you hadn't done that, I wouldn't feel the need to be so mean to you. So there's a lot of that going on as well. The Jekyll and Hyde personality, the walking on eggshells, again, the low empathy. Also how they treat other people, you want to be looking at that too. So if you're seeing all of these things and you're like, check. I recommend, individual therapy if you can afford it. First of all, I know that can be a privilege sometimes, but I generally say no to couples therapy with somebody who is, on that very high end of the spectrum of narcissism, because again, they're not really like maybe they can go to individual therapy and work, but they have to acknowledge first that they have a problem.
It's hard to get them to stay. I will tell you, as a couples therapist, that space that you're talking about where they try to kind of manipulate the therapist. It's not so much that I think that I've been manipulated. It's more that I know that you're a narcissist. And so if I don't give you some attention, you're not going to stick around. And then when I turn up the heat and it starts to feel comfortable, I'm not a good therapist, right? So it's not typically that you want to hang out in therapy for very long. So you get to do, if you're the partner of one, your own individual work so that you start recognizing that's true. That feeling that you're having, that you're uncomfortable, that's absolutely real. And what do you see as your options?
Right. And, I've had women call me and say to me, like, I believe I'm married to a psychopath. People in my life have told me that, or someone said to me, this person's a narcissist. They cheat on me. They constantly lie. And they're asking me to do couples therapy. I actually won't do it if, I have that information up front, but I say, I will work with you individually, but I can't be, that's me colluding with this abuse in a lot of ways. So, I believe like the feminist, the right thing to do is if male or female is being abused, that we work with them on trying to get them out of that relationship, whether it's developing a safety plan. It doesn't have to be immediate, or at least just being supportive of them and helping them take the steps to leave that. Now, again, there are situations where I have couples where there actually may be mutual verbal abuse. But I think what I see when I work with those people is when I see that they take accountability and they're willing to change, and that both people are. And so I think that's okay. If you have a partner who not only is taking accountability, but you're seeing through actions as time goes on that they're really working on this. They're really trying hard not to say
gaining
things to you anymore. Yes. Then I think those are great candidates for couples therapy. So again, it really depends on the situation.
And it's not just males that are narcissists, just so that we're clear. Is there any statistics on like percentage by gender, what we're seeing as far as like these personality disorders?
Usually it's very heavily skewed towards males, just like, again,
Interesting.
psychopathic personalities are, serial killers are, mass murders are, mass shooters, those are all usually heavily skewed male. But we also, we don't really have enough information because we also say a lot of narcissists aren't going to therapy. So when
Right.
people say that they're rare, it's, I actually think a lot of people who go and seek out therapy are actually the opposite of narcissists a lot of
Yeah.
the time. They're very self-aware. They want to know more about themselves. They want to be better, and they take a lot of accountability and responsibility. And so, people have also brought that up to me, that they think that narcissism is underdiagnosed, especially people, again, these people who are survivors of this type of abuse, because they're like, well, therapists aren't really seeing them as much
Yeah,
as their
no,
prevalence in the real world.
I would definitely say that for the majority of clients that I've worked with that could be considered narcissist, it's more like, I'm amazing. Why would I need to go to therapy? You need to get your stuff tight. I mean, if you want me
Yeah.
to go with you and sit while you work on your stuff, I'm happy to, but like, I don't have a problem.
Yes.
I came into
Or
the
you're
world.
the problem. You need
Yeah.
to go to therapy.
Yeah, you need to
Yeah.
get your stuff sorted and then come back when you're good.
Right.
It's not like there's a true narcissist isn't coming in and being like, I want to work on the relationship and I want to figure out how I'm contributing to like our unhappiness. That's not the vibe.
No,
Right.
definitely not.
Okay, so somebody has figured out that they are, dealing with the narcissist. They're all the things that you're saying, feeling like walking on eggshells. I'm not getting acknowledged. I'm having to people please in order to stay in this relationship. And I'm starting to like do my work and working on my self-esteem and healthy boundaries and asking for my needs. What can they expect to receive as a response from the partner that's a narcissist? What will they be anticipating?
It's a varying response. Sometimes it's not pleasant. There's something called narcissistic rage. And so sometimes once you stop the pattern that's happening in that relationship, it kind of throws the narcissistic person off of it. So they may rage a lot at first, especially if you're going to leave them or you start putting up boundaries, because again, these are very manipulative people who don't like boundaries being put up. So you may get that, that type of response. And so what some people learn to do, especially as they're, starting to make a plan to leave, there's something called the gray rock method, which is where you don't give emotional responses at all to the narcissistic person, because they're also looking for a reaction. They kind of thrive off of that reaction.
Slippery slope to get in there and kind of like, well, let me question why you're doing this and then get you off course.
Yeah. There can be an element of sadism to some narcissists where they enjoy other people's pain. They may enjoy seeing you cry or seeing you hurt. So there's things like that. But yeah, sometimes you do have to prepare to know that if you do start putting up boundaries, not that this is a reason not to do it, but you may get some pushback, you may get some rage, you may get some anger. And so, but, kind of sticking to those boundaries, I think, and sticking to this sort of gray rock method of being very even keel is eventually the idea and the hope is that they find a new target, because you aren't giving them what's called this narcissistic supply anymore, this attention, this, eventually they would start to go seek that elsewhere or give up on you giving it to them.
So is this a personality trait where they're not going to keep stalking you, quote unquote, or keep trying to get your attentions back? They're going to just move on to the next love bomb object and like find more low hanging fruit?
A lot of the time, I think that happens. I've also in my research, narcissism is very highly correlated with infidelity. And especially when I was doing my Facebook narcissist book, I have a chapter on like narcissism and infidelity and catfishing and all these things in the research that is like, there is definitely links between these two things. And so I do think a lot of the time, what happens is with not all infidelity again, but a lot of infidelity cases is this situation where they need more attention. The love bombing is a high for them. And so that you may see that as well. But for a lot of people, that's kind of what they want, is like, get this person away from me, let them find somebody else to set their sights on, so I can find a way to leave. Although the narcissist, thus happens too, is they have something called the discard. So they say there's 3 phases of the narcissistic relationship, which is love bombing, which we talked about. Devalue, which is when the darker personality comes out and you get those walking on eggshells, the blame shifting, the gaslighting, all of those things. And then if it goes to that point, is the discard phase where they no longer need you for anything. And for some people, this can be really, really upsetting and traumatic, because when that happens, the narcissistic person leaves you, but it's like they never cared about you. So sometimes that can be they leave you for another person.
Yeah.
And it can feel like you never mattered to them, and that, you know, this whole life you lived with them was an entire lie. And that can be something very, very hard to work through and very, very painful. So that also happens as well.
That is gut-wrenching for my clients, because it feels as if all this work I put in and all this tolerating behavior that was not tolerable because I loved you so much and I wanted to provide an example for you of what you could do or give you what you've never received, and pour my gut into this. And now you just walk away like I never mattered with very little effort to try to get me back, is devastating for clients.
Really devastating.
That guilt and shame and just like this dreaming of a rom-com that you're going to get. Speaking of a rom-com, I mean, just, it's not ever going to happen. And it was never real. It was very one-sided, and that can be so traumatizing. Like, do I even know what real love is?
Yeah. And it can be really hard to trust people again after that. And it's really hard to see that as a blessing in disguise at first.
Yeah. It takes,
you know, to just be like, okay, that this person was just not taking up too much negative energy in my life, was really harmful for me, really toxic for me. Yeah. And now I have a chance to start over again. So that's not something that's easy to see in the beginning either. So, you know, it's really just, you have to have this delicate balance of just holding that space for the client to grieve and validate how painful that is. Yeah. And then hopefully in time that they would come to see that as a kind of a blessing, which happened for me, which I, you know, even to this day, I'm like, thank God I didn't end up with that person, you know,
but that took time
and hindsight. Like I said, hindsight's 20/20.
Well, I love and appreciate you sharing your personal story, because I think it's so impactful when somebody that works in the clinical field is willing to be open and honest and vulnerable and say, hey, I know where you've been. I walked that road and you can get to the other side. And so I really appreciate you providing this insight and inspiration, because going through this time and this kind of relationship is probably one of the hardest relationships to heal from. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to share your story and tell us about your books.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm always happy to share. I think it's important. That's how we connect with each other.
So if somebody wants to find you, where's the best place to reach out to you?
You can find me on my website. I'm on Instagram at Therapy with Lena. That's Lena. And then I have an author page on Facebook, which is just my name, Lena Derhally. And I'm on LinkedIn, Lena Derhally. So any one of those places are good to contact me.
Awesome. Check out the books. They are very well written and very easy to follow along. And you have been as delightful as I thought you would be, Lena. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
This has been the D-Spot Podcast with Dr. Dana McNeil. To learn more about Dr. Dana's practice, simply visit us at www.danamcneil.com.